Hi, I'm Doug, your tech support representative for Atlantic British, and in this video we're going to touch base on a cooling system service for your 1997 Defender 90 as part of your maintenance and service program. Now I want to show you the kit first, and the kit will include your upper and lower radiator hose, your heater hoses, your short stub hose off the front of the engine, your bleeder screw for your one hose to bleed the system out when you're done, new O-ring, thermostat, and thermostat gasket. Now the coolant doesn't come with this. We generally don't supply coolant. It's hard to ship, so you can get that through your local supplier. Any automotive center will have the proper coolant for this. You do want to use the orange Oats technology coolant in this vehicle. It's what's recommended through Land Rover. Do not use the green ethyl glycol. Now what we're going to do is give you the basics and show you locations of these hoses and some tech tips on how to install. Alright, so now we're going to show you how to set up and install your new coolant hoses. And then just for a quick rundown, you have your upper hose. This is the hose that runs from top of radiator to your throttle body heater. Return line from throttle body heater back down into the intake manifold. This is the vent line from top of radiator to the top of your reservoir tank. And then the feed hose that comes off the reservoir tank is actually part of your lower hose, which we'll have a better view of as we get in deeper. So you're going to essentially start off, pull the top shroud. Then we're going to take our fan off, the 36 millimeter. We actually have in our catalog a 36 millimeter fan wrench. Hook that up. This is going to be a right hand thread. So it's not just going to come off like your ordinary nut and bolt. You can do this one of several ways. It's been on there for a while. It's going to be a little tight. So you can actually take like a small pry bar with a small tip and get down between the pulley and one of the pulley retaining bolts. So to act as a stop. And crack that loose. Now we have these fan wrenches in both 36 and 32 millimeter. Those are the two most popular sizes on the Land Rover, but for your 4.0 and 4.6 they're all going to be 36 millimeter, and they're all going to be right hand thread. You'll find on the later Land Rovers that they switched over to left hand thread on the fan. Now, just as a note, it's not a bad idea before you take the fan off all the way, or even before you start to loosen it, grab the fan blade and give it a wiggle. If you feel loose play, it's time for a new fan clutch. Which is easy enough to install with the 4 bolts on the back. The fan clutch is removed, and we do have these in stock. Alright, so fans out. Now we're going to take the belt off. Before you remove the belt, I would suggest one of several things. Take a good visual of the routing and how the belt is installed. If you have a smartphone or a digital camera, take a picture before you take it apart. It'll make a really good reference when you go to put it back together, especially if this is your first time doing this. And I'm just going to take a 15 millimeter socket on the tensioner just below the alternator. Release your pressure, slip off the alternator, and remove your belt. Take a good look at the belt. Look for any dryness, cracking, any splitting in the ribbing. Any of that's going to indicate that the belt is on its way out, and I would suggest now's a good time to replace it. Now before we start pulling hoses off, we got to drain the coolant system. Now because there's no petcock on the bottom of the radiators on these, so there's the only two ways to drain it would be, one is the real messy way, which is to remove the lower hose and have it blast all over the place. Or on the right side, on your right, on the water pump, you have 2 bolts. They're 11/16. That lower bolt right there runs into a water jacket. And if you remove that bolt, you can drain the majority of the system. It'll drain at least down to that level, which is fine. You will have some left over in the lower hose though, so when you get to that, be aware that you still are going to have coolant dump out, but nowhere near as much as if you use that as your primary way of draining the cooling system. Cap off to release any pressure and slide your bolt out. Alright, so we've got the fan out, we've got our shroud off, we've got our belt off, and now we're going to work our way around. We'll start with the easiest one, which is the upper radiator hose. Everything is right there and on top of you. And give the clamps a good look over. If the original clamps are still in good shape, no rust, no corrosion, if they unscrew easily, then you know they're probably in good shape and you can reuse those. The only drawback behind these worm gear style clamps, as opposed to the tensioner clamps that they use now, the type you have to squeeze together to remove, is that over a period of time rubber hoses do dry up and shrink a little bit, which can create leaks because the adjustment on the clamp never changes. So it certainly doesn't hurt once a year at least. Take a good look at your hoses, double check for leaks. Probably want to snug down on the clamps a little bit, and you'll probably find that the majority of them are going to go a turn or two before they snug up again. Alright, usually you can give them a twist and they'll break loose, but you'll find in some cases, as hoses get older, sometimes they seem like they've actually been glued on, in which case a little tool like this with a pointer, you can get down between the hose and the nipple it's attached to and just work it around and kind of break that seal that's developed between the hose and the radiator or the nipple. You'll feel it'll be pretty snug. You pull that out of there and that just breaks it loose nice and easy. You can twist these off. Pour the little excess down in there. Put your clamps aside and one out. Next would be the heater hoses. Again, they're easily accessible and they're right on top. Now the only one that's going to involve a little bit is the little short hose right here connecting the middle elbow, because that is bolted. Actually, nice tip would be to shoot up that bolt a little early as you're getting to it. Sort of help loosen it up when you're ready to remove it. You should loosen the clamp up enough where it completely clears the hose and you can slide it back out of your way when you go to remove it. Now, these clamps have a little rust on the head or whatnot, and they're still in good shape, but you may want to replace them. We'll leave that up to you. You can see these are spinning pretty easily, so we'll probably hold on to these clamps. Okay, and again, a little separator tool, and you can actually hear this one's a little crusty, so a bond has definitely been set up between the hose and the pipe. Work it around a couple times, get it broken loose. Give the hose a twist. And there's one. Take the clamp off, we'll set that aside. there's two. Now, just to make it a little bit easier, we're just going to pop the 3 clips off the end of the air filter housing, because they tuck these hoses in behind it, and it's pretty easy to remove. It's only a matter of seconds actually. And we'll pull that off, and actually once you have that off, take a few minutes, take a look at your air filter, see what kind of condition that's in. Would be a good idea to change it if it's dirty. And we're going to remove these 2 clamps, pot these hoses, and then we'll have the heater hoses off. Alright, one tip on this. The top of this heater core, which is right in here where the heater hoses run into, this is a phenolic plastic. And this is in an area that gets heated and cooled and heated and cooled, and they become very brittle. So when you go to remove the hoses, just keep that in mind, that you really can't get in there and horse the tool hard. You just need to be sort of gentle and just slide it around without putting a lot of force on it. Should you break it or crack it, then you're going to have to put a new heater core in. Now this is the first time these hoses have come off in quite some time, so you can see that when done properly they do come off relatively easy. Slide your clamp off, put that aside. You can see you still end up with coolant trapped in the hoses here and there, so keep that in mind when you pull them off. And we'll toss those aside. So now we have the upper off, we have the heater hoses off. Now we're going to get to the lower hose, and it's much easier to access that hose by taking the lower part of the shroud off, which is 4 Phillips screws and these brackets. Now I find to take these brackets off, they tuck them in underneath the retainer bracket for the radiator and the AC condenser. So you would need to remove these 2 bolts, which in their infinite wisdom they put as nut and bolt. So you also need to remove the grill to access these 2. Or you find on these are fairly thin tabs that once you take the screws out, well, you should be able to bend them forward and slide this out without having to go through those upper brackets. Alright, so we've taken the 4 screws out. I took the brackets, bent these straight up. These are very bendable. You'll be able to push those right back down to place when you go to install it. Lift up on your bottom shroud a little bit and then slide it over somewhat to the driver's side, and that'll clear the bottom section of this from the small vent hoses on the top of the radiator. Just push in a little bit and wiggle up to the side, and we're out. Now you find you got some better access to that lower hose there, along with you'll need to take this hose off at this clamp, and then there's another hose underneath that goes to this metal tube, and that's kind of that's going to be a feel for. You get your fingers down in there, you're going to feel the screw, you're going to unclamp it, and you're probably going to end up having to push it off. And you can, with a flashlight, actually look down between the back of the air conditioning compressor mount and the head on the passenger side, and you can see that straight down. So to get that hose off, probably the easiest would be once the clamp is off, you take a long straight blade screwdriver, run it down in, and you can pop the hose down and off the line. So we're going to do that. We're going to take those 3 clamps off and then basically take what is essentially a 3 hose assembly off in one shot. Alright, this is the clamp that's going to give you problems. Because of where it's located, this is always the one that's rusted up. Now, as you see, I've tried to remove that, and the slot at the end of the clamp line has basically rotted right off. So the next step would be is to try to cut it off. You could probably run your hand in there with a hacksaw blade, or you can run up through the bottom with a long extended chisel, make it a nice sharp one. That metal tube, if you damage the metal tube, well, you can replace it. It just unbolts off of there. But this is the clamp that's going to give you problems. This is the one that you can't see from the top. Now I've disconnected the lower part of the lower hose and let everything drain out and wipe the area down so you don't have to contend with coolant dripping in your face while you're trying to get this clamp out. Once that's out, then your lower hose will come right out. Alright, so now we remove the lower hose. We have the heater hoses out of the way, the upper and lower hose, and now we're going to change over the thermostat. And what you're going to need is a 7/16 socket, short extension, and a ratchet. There's only 2 bolts that hold it in place. This is your wire over to your fuse box from the alternator. You can always slide that up and out of the way. Sneak underneath. And grab the bolt. Okay, and you'll see your gasket will be stuck on the thermostat housing. The thermostat is in place. Before I pop that out of there, because I'm sure there's probably some more coolant trapped back in there. It won't be a lot, but there'll be some. Let's throw a rag under there so that we're not dealing with coolant in the valley. Doesn't really hurt anything, but when you fire it up and the engine gets warm, you're going to smell coolant. And we can take a long screwdriver or a short pry bar to the side, just give it a pop. And there we go. Here's your old thermostat. Okay, now if you notice the way it was situated with this area facing the hose and the ball area in the motor, make sure that you install it in that position. Now there's also a little bleed valve on these, so that as you're filling it, this will allow some air to pass through, so the system will eventually bleed itself out and vent. You want to make sure that that bleeder is in the 12 o'clock position when you put that thermostat back in. Now we're going to take a few minutes. We're going to clean off the housing. We're going to clean the gasket off. We can wire brush it, scrape it. There's a number of different ways, but either way, it's all got to come off. So we'll take care of that. Alright, so we're going to reinstall the thermostat. This is the new one you get with your kit. Again, there's the little bleeder. We want to install that just the way it came out of the front of the intake manifold, with the heated section toward the back and the bleeder at 12 o'clock. Now, this can be a real pain in the butt if you're trying to install this without any type of adhesive or whatnot, because you want to hold that thermostat in place. There is a recess machined into the front of the intake manifold where this sits. Without some kind of adhesive or something tacky just to hold it in place, it'll keep dropping out of there as you're trying to install the outer housing. And in some cases, and I've seen it done, if this is not sitting down in the recess, but in fact the one lip of it is up on the face, when you tighten down on the housing, you can crack the housing. So I use either high-tech, which works very good. This is made by Permatex. There's also an amber colored adhesive called Indian Head that I've used for years and years that works just as well. So we got it tacked up. Again, we're going to make sure our bleeder is up at 12 o'clock. And then we'll give this a little twist side to side to spread that adhesive out a little bit. So now that'll hold that in place while you're getting your housing and your gasket in place. Same thing. You just put a little bit of the high-tech on there, and it's just enough to hold it all in place so the gasket doesn't slide out of its position. You don't want to pinch the gasket. You certainly don't want to leak when you're done. Doesn't take a lot, just a little bit. Nice thin coat. I actually really don't want it to be too thick, because then it can lump up and actually create a leak as opposed to stop one. Tack your gasket in place. Set it up so your holes line up. Doesn't matter, you can also be 180 degrees off. Gasket sits the same both directions. 2 bolts, and I usually like to start the bolts in the holes before I bring the housing in place, and I can actually hold the bolt heads in place. And we'll slide that down in there, line up our holes, and again, you just want to be careful you don't knock that thermostat out of its position. And we'll thread that in so it just about bottoms out. You don't have to make them super tight. You want to turn them in until you feel them bottom out, and then maybe just a little seating, just a little push to make them seat. You should just put a little weight on there, and that's about all it takes. For those of you that like to use a torque wrench, probably 25, 30 foot-pounds will work just fine. So now we got our thermostat in place, and we're going to put our wire back in line where it belongs, and then we'll now start putting our hoses back on. What we're going to do first, before we start doing that, these 2 metal lines or tubes here for the heater hoses, sometimes these have a tendency where you can actually get a buildup of rust in there that can cause a restriction. So we're actually going to take the 2 out. We want to clean them up anyway, and then we're also going to replace this short section of hose right here that connects the one heater hose, the 90 degree, to the manifold. And this also comes with your set. Okay, so now we're going to need to remove this metal tube right here, the elbow, so that we can access and remove this short rubber hose right here. Now this one's very important to change, because this is the one, because it's so close to the engine, gets very hot, is susceptible to high pressure, and this is the one that usually deteriorates first, and when you get a burst hose, it's usually that one. So you definitely want to change that over. You've got a small bolt with an 8mm head, and that holds a clamp that holds the 2 tubes together. This top tube runs down and behind the mounting bracket for the alternator and the power steering pump, and there actually is a bolted bracket down in there to access it. Most cases you have to take the AC compressor and the alternator off, remove the bracket, and then you can get to that lower. But for the most part, these usually hold up pretty well, and it's the smaller tube that we're taking out which usually ends up the rustier of the 2, as you can see. Now you got some flaking and whatnot. This is just outer paint, but if you got any areas that look like they're pinholing, or if the metal feels soft, replace this as well. It doesn't come with the kit, but it would be a nice piece of say, a little security, so that you don't end up having to do this again. Now we've taken the clamps out of this short hose, and I find usually this area down here is fairly tough to get at, but if you take a straight blade screwdriver and get up behind the hose and lift, you can usually sneak it off there. And this one is actually very clean. It came off relatively easy. So that's our little culprit right there. Now this is a specialty hose. You'll notice if you look at the inner diameter on this side versus this side, this hose is actually 2 different sizes on each end. Keep that in mind when you go to install it, that the larger end is going to go on the nipple on the lower intake manifold. So now we're at the point we got everything off. We're going to clean up all our areas where we reattach the hose and start putting our system back together. Alright, so now we're ready to put our hoses back on. You're going to have your 2 heater hoses. We're going to run from the 2 metal pipes, which we've cleaned up a little bit, and your heater core in the back. Now remember, you got 2 different sizes pipes. These are the hoses. These hoses are just slightly different, but the shorter hose is going to connect from this lower pipe to the front connector for the heater core, the larger from the back connector at the heater core down to the longer pipe down here. So it's just a matter of slip them on, tighten them down, and then we'll move on to the next. We're going to essentially work from top down till we get to the lower radiator hose. Alright, so now we have the heater hoses hooked up. We're going to do a little scan just so you can get an idea of orientation and how we set up the clamps. Then of course when you're done, don't forget to put the snorkel back on your air filter cover. That's just the 3 clamps and that's on. And then we're going to get into the upper radiator hose, which is pretty cut and dry. It's just a straight up, one end fits the other. You can look at the configuration. You'll see one long end, one short end after each bend. So the long end is going to go towards engine side. Set your clamps for orientation. Slide your hose on, clamp it down. Alright, so here's your lower hose. Lower hose is going to orient like so. And if you remember, we have one connection up underneath that's pretty much done by feel. You might be able to get at it from underneath. I usually set it up and then I'm able to get both hands in from the top. You could try whatever works more comfortable with you, but the most thing is the routing of the hose that goes back up to the reservoir, how it sneaks in underneath the air conditioning compressor. Just remember how you took the old one out. But when you set it in, it's a lot easier to run the longer hose down in first and snake that around. Careful about catching your clamps on the radiator. You don't want to make any punctures there. And as you can see, there we go. We can eventually get it there. Put the bottom in. Alright, so there's our little hose that comes off the lower hose assembly. As you can see, it's not easy access. You can get it from the top, you can get it from the bottom, but you'll need to twist up a little bit. But here he's showing fully seated with the clamp in place. And that's pretty much it. There's your lower hose attached to the water pump. And then across over to your radiator. Everything clamped up nice and tight. So now we're going to fill it with coolant and we're going to bleed the system out. Alright, so now we put all the hoses in place. We got everything clamped down. We're going to put our coolant in. This is the recommended coolant by Land Rover for this engine, which is the XLC. It has organic acid technology, which is both antifreeze and a coolant, and it has what they call a bittering agent in it. It's orange in color, and it's the best coolant to use on these because it will not counteract or have any reaction to any of the materials used in the cooling system on this. So essentially what we'll do now is at this point is we're going to top it off with coolant. We're going to let it bleed down. We're going to start the vehicle, and we can start it without the fan. I'm just going to run it for about a minute. All we want to do essentially is run it for a minute, shut it down, check for any leaks, because now is the time to do it while you have easy access to your connections. If everything looks good, put your fan, your belt, and your shroud back in place, which is just the opposite of your removal, and you're ready to get down the road. So when you're ready to change over the hoses on your Defender, Discovery, or any other Land Rover, call any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210. And thanks for watching.